Cameron Hayes. Cameron Hayes was a name that reverberated throughout the streets of London, Manchester, and Birmingham as if it were a curse whispered in darkened alleys after midnight. From the outset, every meticulous detail of his life had been chronicled by investigators, journalists, and the occasional philosopher who found dark fascination in the interplay of human morality and law enforcement. His story was one woven with deliberate precision, narrated by detectives' interviews, recollections of moments once thought to be buried in archives of unspeakable crimes, and a tone that was as clinical as it was horrifying. The narrative of Cameron's descent into infamy began like a case study in psychological disintegration. On the rainy evening of October 12, 2007, in the heart of London's East End, a heinous act would forever alter the lives of those who crossed his path. The details of that night were recorded in painstaking testimony during police interviews, discourses that were as methodical as they were unsettling. Detective John Parker, a veteran of many cases, recalled with measured calmness, Cameron's actions that night were deliberate. Each movement, each calculated breath seemed choreographed. There was no impulsiveness, only premeditated resolution. It was under the fluorescent glare of the interrogation room that the first fragments of his tortured past were disclosed. In a small, stark room of Scotland Yard, Cameron sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the blank wall as Detective Elizabeth Moore began to ask questions that would peel back layers of repression. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice devoid of any overt judgment, "we need to understand the rationale behind your actions. Walk me through the events of that fateful night and tell us about your past that led you here." His reply was a measured, almost mechanical recitation of events that spanned decades, a timeline punctuated by instances of inadequacy, betrayal, and despair. According to the official transcript, Cameron began by recounting early memories of his troubled youth. Born in a modest suburb of Manchester, he was the son of a factory worker and a woman whose own life had been marred by loss and regret. "I grew up feeling abandoned by a system that was never designed for me," he said during one recording session, his voice calm yet resonating with a deep-seated anger. Interviews later revealed that a series of personal betrayals ranging from the dismissal of his academic potential to the public humiliation inflicted by those he once trusted had festered within him until they burst forth in a series of calculated acts of violence. The narrative took an even darker turn when multiple accounts from acquaintances were pieced together. From the whispering corridors of a Manchester library to the cold, isolated backrooms of Birmingham's detention centres, whispers of secret meetings and clandestine figures began to appear. Cameron's actions did not occur in isolation, rather, they were the culmination of years of abuse, failure, and the deliberate shaping of a singular worldview where morality was a concept only applied to the weak. "I didn't see it as murder," he later explained in a formal police interview, his voice almost eerie in its composure. "I saw it as retribution, a final, irrevocable solution to problems that society refused to acknowledge." His calculated approach became even more apparent when Detective Thomas Evans, a forensic psychologist, was brought in to analyze Cameron's pattern of behavior. In an hour-long interview that was transcribed with clinical precision, Evans described Cameron's background as a mosaic of seemingly ordinary incidents juxtaposed with unexplained bursts of violence. "What struck me most was his ability to compartmentalize," Evans said. "Every decision he made was based on a methodical analysis of cause and effect. We were not dealing with a man driven solely by passion or madness, but by a precise calculation that allowed him to justify his felonies as rational acts." On a damp morning in mid-November 2007, as fog rolled in over the Thames, Detective Parker revisited the scene at an abandoned warehouse in East London, the place that had served as both a sanctuary for Cameron's darkest impulses and the evidence repository for a string of related crimes. Meticulous notes had been made at the scene, traces of blood carefully preserved, personal items that hinted at his turbulent past, and cryptic symbols scrawled on the walls. Parker's narrative, recorded in a detailed voice memo later submitted to the chief inspector, stressed the precision with which the killer had orchestrated every moment. The alignment of evidence with Cameron's own accounts from that night leaves little doubt that he meticulously arranged every detail. The interviews next took a form that was more conversational as Cameron's long-guarded secrets were slowly laid bare. In one session, Detective Moore revisited a memory from Cameron's adolescence. "You often spoke of feeling like an outcast," Moore recalled. "Was that isolation something that influenced your later actions?" Cameron's eyes, unblinking and fixed on the distant corner of the room, gave nothing away until he finally responded softly, "Isolation was my only truth. I began to understand that to be isolated meant embracing a truth that I shared with no one, and that truth eventually demanded a price. I was not made for a forgiving world." Between interviews, the narrative meandered through moments of mundane daily activity: a cup of bitter tea served at a shabby prison cafeteria, the soft hum of fluorescent lights in a visitation room, and the cold, unyielding scrutiny of legal procedures. Chambers of the Old Bailey in London became the stage upon which Cameron's fate was sealed. There, in the presence of stoic magistrates and a jury that observed every intonation of his measured tone, Cameron repeated many of the sentiments previously voiced in the interrogation rooms. His eloquence in describing his life's injustices painted a picture that invited both horror and reluctant understanding among those who were forced to reconcile his words with the monstrosity of his actions. Even as the trial progressed, investigative reporters sought to discover the truth behind the cold logic of his defense. In a series of interviews between journalists and law enforcement officials, names such as Martin Davis, a chronicler of notorious English criminals, surfaced repeatedly. "He was invariably calm, his logic chilling in its clarity," remarked Davis in an exclusive broadcast from Manchester. "Every statement, every pause, harkened back to a lifetime of calculated vengeance, a life spent in incremental steps towards that irrevocable night." Yet, it was not only the professional voices that filled the public record. Personal recollections from individuals who had once known him as a distant, troubled child gradually made their way into the record. His former schoolteacher, Mrs. Judith Collins, recalled in a police interview how he was a quiet student who rarely participated in class. "I once asked him why he never raised his hand," she recounted softly, "and his response was, 'Because every answer given is another opportunity to be wrong.'" In hindsight, it was a cry of resignation, an omen of his eventual future. These remarks, interlaced with police evidence and corroborated by eyewitness testimony, constructed a mosaic of a man whose very perception of right and wrong had been irrevocably warped by life's relentless pressures. Detective Parker meticulously documented each thread of evidence, from the shattered glass fragments found at the scene to the untraceable phone calls made in the early hours of that fatal night. During a tense interview session recorded on an overcast winter day, Parker explained, "Every piece of evidence we gathered reflected a mind that was restless and calculating." Cameron's confessions, though delivered in a measured tone, betrayed a sharp intellect that understood every consequence of his actions. The methodical tone in Parker's voice painted a portrait not of a deranged criminal, but of a man who had analyzed each step as one might solve a complex mathematical problem, with negligible room for error or remorse. In the shadowed recesses of the police archives, another interview emerged, a session where Cameron was pressed on the nature of remorse and redemption. Sergeant William Harris, whose voice was as steady as the ticking of a clock in an otherwise silent room, asked, "Do you feel any remorse for what you have done?" Cameron's reply was unflinching, "Remorse is a luxury afforded to those who have time to reflect on their mistakes. In my analysis, the actions I undertook were a logical response to a world that continually neglected my existence." That answer was neither an admission of guilt nor a declaration of justification. It was a clinical observation, a distillation of a lifetime of perceived injustice and a rationale that would haunt him for years to come. The narrative of Cameron Hayes was not strictly confined to his own confessions, however. Through the painstaking efforts of detectives, corroborative interviews with family members and acquaintances revealed a man whose outward demeanor was often deceptive. His estranged sister, Margaret Hayes, recalled in a tearful yet composed interview with the Manchester Evening News, "Cameron was always the quiet one, always lost in thought. We never imagined that his introspection hid such darkness. There was something in his eyes, a glimmer of determination that often went unrecognized until it was too late." These personal testimonials added layers to the investigation, suggesting that behind the facade of analytical coldness lay a turbulent history marked by loss, ambition, and the inability to reconcile with a society he felt had wronged him repeatedly. As the legal proceedings continued, the courtroom transformed into a theater of both rational argument and raw emotion. Cameron's defense team, led by the well-respected attorney Richard Mason, argued that his client's actions, while undeniably heinous, were the product of a deeply flawed system that had repeatedly failed to provide him with the guidance and support necessary to lead a law-abiding life. "This is not to excuse what he has done," Mason stated in a measured tone that resonated with both gravity and clinical detachment, "but to understand that when an individual is driven to such lengths, it is a sign of systemic failure, a failure that calls for a broader scrutiny of our social institutions." The jurors, exposed to layers of meticulous detail regarding his past, were left grappling with conflicting narratives that oscillated between calculated coldness and the tragic inevitability of human frailty. One rainy afternoon in Birmingham, in a small interrogation room lined with peeling yellow wallpaper and the hum of an outdated air conditioning unit, Detective Evans revisited pivotal moments from Cameron's youth. The conversation took an almost investigative tone, reminiscent of a psychological case study. "Tell me, Cameron," Evans prompted softly, "was there a moment when you felt truly abandoned?" After a tense pause that stretched for what seemed like an eternity, Cameron's voice was barely above a whisper as he confessed, "There was a night in 1995 after my father's death when I realized that the world did not care about a man weakened by sorrow. That night, as I sat alone in a rundown hostel on the outskirts of Manchester, I swore that I would never be vulnerable again." The admission, delivered with unsettling candor, laid bare the origin of many of his later choices, a decision not forged in malice, but in the crucible of abandonment. Throughout the subsequent days, the police interviews became methodical reconstructions of his psychological evolution. In one particularly striking transcript, Detective Moore pressed him on the significance of a journal he had kept over the years. "Your journal entries indicate recurrent themes of betrayal and a desire for retribution," she stated. Cameron's eyes, which had once harbored the secrets of a repressed soul, now shone with an inner fire as he responded, "Every word I wrote was a blueprint. A record of all the injustices inflicted upon me and by extension, upon the countless others who are rendered voiceless by society. I documented them so that someday, these grievances would be acknowledged." His voice, measured and deliberate, did not waver despite the weight of his confession. It was a revelation that further complicated the narrative, blurring the lines between justification and premeditation, between human vulnerability and the chilling capacity for calculated violence. The dense, methodical tone of the interviews was matched by the relentless scrutiny of the media. Journalists pounded the doors of Scotland Yard and the Old Bailey with questions that sought to mix sensationalism with intellectual inquiry. In a televised interview conducted on a rainy evening in central London, a reporter queried, "Mr. Hayes, given the meticulous planning evident in your actions, do you consider yourself more of a strategist than a mere murderer?" Cameron's reply, delivered with an almost clinical detachment, was, "I consider myself an analyst of human behavior. My actions were the results of a logical sequence, a response to a world that operated on false precepts of morality." The statement sent ripples through public discourse, with pundits debating whether his thoughtful articulation was an ingenious veneer masking sociopathic tendencies or an unsettling admission of a system that had, in its own way, precipitated his downfall. The sheer volume of evidence and the consistency of his narrative left investigators with little room for doubt. Detective Parker later compiled his final report, a document that spanned over 150 pages and extensively referenced the recorded police interviews, forensic analysis, and corroborative testimonies from multiple witnesses. A review of the case from a multidisciplinary perspective reinforces the conclusion that every act committed by Cameron Hayes was executed with a calculated awareness of consequence, Parker wrote. His report was a testament to the methodical unraveling of a man whose life had become an endless quest for vindication through carefully orchestrated violence. The setting of London's underbelly, the foggy docks along the River Thames, the rain-slicked pavements of suburban boroughs, and the secluded corridors of derelict warehouses formed a backdrop for a narrative that was as much about the environment as it was about an individual's shattered psyche. The urban landscape, with its historical weight and cultural contradictions, served as a constant reminder that beneath the surface of any city, dark undercurrents compelled human actions that defied conventional morality. As dusk settled over London on the anniversary of his capture, the city's lights reflected back the somber reality of a man who, in his own words, was merely an embodiment of a flawed system. In one of the more intimate interviews recorded during his imprisonment at HMP Belmarsh, Cameron's tone shifted for the first time to something indistinguishable from regret. Sitting across from Sergeant Harris in a sparse visiting room, he allowed the silence to stretch before speaking softly, "I sometimes wonder if, had I been given the chance to navigate life differently, perhaps my actions could have been redirected towards something constructive. Instead, I became the instrument of my own despair." His words rippled through the room, leaving both the officer and the visiting family members in a state of pensive silence. It was an admission that, even as he recounted meticulous plans and deliberate executions, there was an undercurrent of personal failure, a recognition that the path he had chosen was a byproduct of systemic deficiencies that extended far beyond his individual responsibility. As days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the narrative of Cameron Hayes became a subject of academic scrutiny. Universities, particularly in London and Manchester, hosted symposiums where forensic psychologists, criminologists, and ethicists debated the implications of his case. Dr. Andrew Wallace, a renowned criminologist from the University of Manchester, presented an analysis of his interviews. "What we see in the narrative of Cameron Hayes is a fusion of rationality and abnormality, a man who calculated every move yet could never escape the ghosts of his past." His interviews are as much a confession as they are a meticulously scripted narrative designed to evoke both sympathy and revulsion. Such discussions emphasized that, regardless of the brutality of his actions, Cameron had engineered his own downfall through a series of choices that were as reflective of his inner turmoil as they were of his analytical prowess. The analytic tone that had characterized every piece of evidence was not lost on those who sought understanding rather than mere retribution. Even within the rigid confines of the courtroom, Professor Eleanor Reed, an expert in criminal psychology, remarked in an interview with The Guardian, "Cameron Hayes's case transcends the simplistic dichotomy of good versus evil. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that systemic neglect can lead to the emergence of individuals who view themselves as both victim and executioner." His calculated demeanor is a facade that belies an existential struggle, a struggle that, if left unaddressed by society, becomes catastrophic. Throughout the ensuing years, as Cameron's trial concluded and he was sentenced to life imprisonment, reflections on his past were revisited not only by those who had once interrogated him but by the wider community as well. In a series of televised interviews conducted from behind prison walls, he was asked to reflect on the legacy of his actions. "I am now a symbol of what happens when a man is pushed to the extremes of isolation and despair," he stated in one such interview. "My life is not a testament to raw evil, but rather a mirror held up to a society that oftentimes fails to acknowledge its own shortcomings." His words, though delivered in a tone as analytical as ever, sparked intense public debate about the nature of justice, redemption, and the role of societal institutions in shaping individual destinies. While the figure of Cameron Hayes loomed large in the annals of criminal history, various voices within law enforcement never ceased in their quest for a deeper understanding of his motives. In a confidential meeting at Scotland Yard, several senior officers discussed the case with a focus on preventive measures rather than mere punishment. "Cameron's background is a cautionary tale," said Inspector Robert Simmons with a measured calmness. "His progression from a troubled child to a calculated murderer is indicative of early warning signs that we simply failed to address. We must learn from this to refine our approach in mental health, education, and community support. Only then can we hope to mitigate the birth of future Cameron Hayeses." Even as forensic experts presented reams of data, meticulous timelines, digital footprints, and forensic correlations, the narrative of Cameron Hayes remained anchored in a series of human testimonies. His own recollections during police interviews served both as an admission of guilt and a lament over lost potential. In one of the final recorded sessions before his trial, Detective Moore asked, "Looking back on your life, do you see a single moment where the path might have been different?" Cameron's reply, measured and devoid of overt emotion, was, "Every moment was a fork in a road I chose not to take." The cumulative weight of each decision eventually coalesced into the monster you now judge me by. It was a statement that encapsulated the tragedy of his existence, a life that had been defined not solely by the brutality of his actions but by the myriad instances of pain, neglect, and an unyielding determination to exact a long-delayed form of justice. The story of Cameron Hayes, meticulously documented over hours of interviews, court testimonies, and forensic investigations, slowly evolved into a broader sociological study. The lines between a calculated criminal and a scorned victim blurred, and in the clinical dissection of his narrative, society was forced to confront its own moral ambiguities. Academic papers, policy debates, and media retrospectives all pointed to a singular conclusion, that the genesis of extreme behavior often lay in the interplay between individual disposition and the systematic failures of a society ill-equipped to provide for its most vulnerable members. In one of the more reflective moments recounted during a televised debate on BBC One, Professor Reed summarized the legacy of the case. "The trial of Cameron Hayes is not merely a chapter in a criminal saga," she posited, "it is a mirror into our social consciousness. His story is both a warning and an opportunity, a call to re-examine the ways in which we care for those who slip through the cracks of our communal safety net." Her measured analysis resonated with thousands of viewers, prompting a nationwide dialogue about justice, mental health, and societal responsibility. Outside the formal corridors of justice, life in the affected communities carried on with an undercurrent of poignant reflection. Residents of East London, still haunted by the memory of the crimes that had marred their streets, shared hushed remembrances in local cafes and community halls. A longtime resident of Shoreditch, speaking off the record to a local newspaper, observed, "It's as if we all became unwilling participants in his narrative. We listened to every detail with a mix of horror and disbelief, wondering how one man could so thoroughly dissect the fabric of our community and rebuild it in his own distorted image." Her comments, while personal, echoed the broader sentiment that the case was a catalyst for introspection on issues of isolation, failure, and the inevitable repercussions when societal support systems fall apart. As the years slowly passed, the details of the case were archived in criminal records and academic journals alike. Yet, the resonance of Cameron Hayes's narrative continued to stimulate debates in hushed tones among forensic experts, criminologists, and even ordinary citizens who found themselves questioning the underpinnings of modern society. The meticulous recounting of the police interviews served not only as evidence in a court of law but also as a lifelong record for those who believed that every crime was symptomatic of deeper structural issues, a poignant reminder that every calculated act of violence bore the imprint of a broken system. During one final interview recorded for a documentary on notorious criminals of modern Britain, Cameron's tone maintained its analytical detachment even as he was poised to describe his childhood memories in unvarnished detail. Sitting in front of a camera, he calmly recounted, "I was raised in a world where I was constantly measured against expectations that I could never meet. Every slight, every neglect, was etched into my mind as a directive for retribution. In my analysis, I became not a mere murderer, but a corrector of wrongs, a role that society, in its infinite complexity, both condemned and necessitated." His words, juxtaposed against the gravity of his actions, underscored the enduring question that haunted legal scholars and moral philosophers alike: when does calculated analysis of a flawed environment become the impetus for monstrous deeds? In reviewing the exhaustive transcripts and recorded interviews from those long ago days, future investigators would note the consistent methodology with which Cameron had approached every step of his transformation. His actions, far from being the result of spontaneous rage, were the culmination of decades of observation, calculation, and remorse. At one juncture, a younger Detective Simmons remarked during a departmental review meeting, "The layers of his narrative, each one recorded painstakingly by police and presented in court, offer us more than evidence. They offer insight into a mind that operated on a logic uniquely its own." Such sentiments solidified the reputation of the case as a veritable blueprint for understanding the genesis of extreme criminal behavior. And so, the story of Cameron Hayes unfolded with a deliberate audacity, a life marked by precision, a mind honed by systematic betrayals, and a series of irrevocable actions meticulously documented down to the finest detail. The interviews, the forensic reports, and the courtroom statements collectively painted the portrait of a man who was both methodical in his execution and tragic in the depths of his isolation. His legacy, forever enshrined in police reports and academic discourses, served as a grim reminder that behind every act of violence lies a far more complex narrative, a narrative that demands we look beyond the surface to understand the myriad forces at play. In the final analysis, the narrative of Cameron Hayes remains an emblem of the enduring struggle within society, the clash between individual agency and the pervasive influence of systemic neglect. His story, as recounted through hours of police interviews and methodical investigation, compels us to acknowledge the painful truth that while justice can mete out punishment, it must also examine the underlying causes that give rise to such calculated brutality. Every recorded word, every carefully documented detail, serves as both a memorial to a life marred by relentless hardship and a challenge to our collective responsibility in preventing similar tragedies in the future. Now, as twilight descends on the case files and the voices of investigators fade into the annals of legal history, the legacy of Cameron Hayes resonates as a sober, analytical reminder that behind every convicted murderer lies a labyrinthine history of systemic failures, personal betrayals, and the inescapable consequences of a society that leaves its most vulnerable to fend for themselves. The narrative of his life, a life characterized by a methodical breakdown of human emotion into calculated, irrevocable acts, continues to serve as both evidence and a cautionary tale. In every meticulously recorded police interview, every measured exchange in the courtroom, and every whispered recollection in a quiet London street, the story of Cameron Hayes endures as a forensic case study in the darkest recesses of the human condition. This detailed account of a rational, yet remorseless analyst of society's flaws is a stark reminder that every life, no matter how calculated or cold, is born from experiences that are as human as they are tragic. Through the lens of police interviews and on-site investigations, the intricate tapestry of Cameron Hayes's life was laid bare, revealing a man whose choices were formed in a crucible of neglect, betrayal, and a systemic failure to nurture those deemed unworthy. His sentence, handed down within the insulated environs of justice, was both a retribution for individual actions and a symbol of a larger, more complex social pathology that continues to haunt our modern landscape. It is essential to note that this entire narrative stands as a meticulously crafted fictional tale, a synthesis of creative storytelling and methodical investigative detail, designed to provoke thought and spark discussion on the interplay between individual actions and systemic influence. The characters, dialogues, police interviews, and even the geographical backdrop are entirely products of the imagination. While the analytical tone and clinical precision of the narrative echo the language of real forensic reports and legal proceedings, every element of this story is a work of fiction, constructed purely for the purposes of narrative exploration. This is a fictional tale and not based on actual events. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to my channel, like, and check the description to find out how you can support my work.